Lecture 5, The Industrial Revolution. We will backtrack in this lecture to the middle of the 1700s when the so-called Industrial Revolution began in England. Beginning with the invention of the steam engine, we will briefly examine a few inventions from these times, including the creatively efficient manner of organizing labor. For these innovations to occur, a fitting historical context was required. You will be introduced to three ways where the people of these times were historically conditioned to be open to inventing time and labor-saving machines and new ways of approaching work. This will be followed by looking at the life of the common worker, in particular children. Finally, we will conclude with how the Industrial Revolution gave rise to competing political ideologies and led to the gradual elimination of a traditional understanding of a nation's directive relationship to commerce. We will conclude this lecture by admiring first artistic realism, followed by symbolism, that in part owe their following to the Industrial Revolution. Innovations of the Industrial Revolution. A few of the innovations of the Industrial Revolution was the use of steam power by relying on the steam engine, the use of railways, the use of machine tools, the refined manners of making iron, the replacement of organic wood-based fuels with fossil coal fuel, the use of mechanical seeders in agriculture, the use of water power, the invention of machines that replace much human labor, such as the spinning jenny, and the efficient systematization of labor by structuring factory work around assembly lines. The assembly line manner of production was promoted in the U.S. by the automaker Henry Ford. According to his work methodology, each worker is to specialize in a task that he is to perform repeatedly and efficiently with as little movement as possible. Causes of the Industrial Revolution. The Christian belief that physical world is reasonable because a divine reason created it helped to provide a fitting historical context during the 1700s that human beings are capable of understanding laws within nature and hence, in a certain sense, master nature with machines and scientific inventions. Joseph Ratzinger eloquently explains this basic idea of Christianity inherited by the people of the 1700s, that the world is capable of being understood because it was created by an intelligent being, and I quote from him. In the ancient medieval view, all being is therefore what has been thought, the thought of the absolute spirit. Conversely, this means that since all being is thought, all being is meaningful, logos, truth. It follows from this traditional view that human thinking is the rethinking of being itself, rethinking of the thought which is being itself. Man can rethink logos, the meaning of his being, because his own logos, his own reason, is logos of the one logos, thought of the original thought, of the creative spirit that permeates and governs his being. End of quote. Another important historical context that helped to set the stage for the Industrial Revolution originated in the practices of Catholic monasteries, which, although suppressed in England by Henry VIII in the 16th century, deeply influenced the psyche of the Renaissance man both in England and in mainland Europe. The clockwork-like assembly lines that Henry Ford describes has a predecessor in medieval European Benedictine monasteries. As explained in the introduction to Lewis Mumford's book Techniques and Civilization, I quote, "In Benedictine monasteries of medieval Europe, spiritual and working life was divided into precise units of time, the canonical hours, as a way to magnify the strength of the monk's religious devotion. This regimen gave rise to a need for devices that could measure time, hence the development of the first simple, reliable clocks. The monasteries, in Mumford's view, helped to give human enterprise the regular collective beat and rhythm of the machine, for the clock is not merely a means of keeping track of hours, but of synchronizing the actions of men." End of quote. A third important context that, in part, explains the occurrence of the Industrial Revolution during the 1700s comes from Protestantism, specifically the Protestant work ethic. Perhaps unfairly, the German sociologist Max Weber describes his Protestant work ethic most notable among the Calvinists as based on the principle that wasting time is, and I quote, "the first and in principle the deadliest sins. The span of human life is infinitely short and precious to make sure of one's own election. Loss of time through sociability, idle talk, luxury, even more sleep than is necessary for health, 6 to at most 8 hours is worth of absolute moral condemnation. Thus, inactive contemplation is also valueless, or even reprehensible, if it is at the expense of one's daily work." End of quote. In contrast, Catholicism, with its long history of honoring contemplation, and people specifically devoting their lives to contemplation, places less accent on the need to work. Workers of the Industrial Revolution. As factories began to be built, machines were invented that replaced traditional forms of human labor, and people not capable of competing with the efficiency of factory production migrated from the countryside to the cities, which served as industrialized centers. By 1851, for the first time in England, as detailed by Eric J. Hobsbawm, people living in industrial centers outnumbered those living in the country. By 1881, Hobsbawm estimates 2/5 of all the English and Welsh lived in the 6 major industrial cities of London, southeast Lancashire, the West Midlands, West Yorkshire, Merseyland, and Tyneside. Factory owners found it profitable to hire children from the age of 5 and upwards, since it was customary to pay children significantly lower wages compared to paying adults performing the same work. And children could fit in small spaces and do tasks that required dexterity that few adults could. For example, children called bobbin boys were employed to tie cotton threads that broke on looms. Children also were hired to drag coal up very narrow mine tunnels. Factory owners wanted child labor so much that they even sought out children from government-owned housing projects called poorhouses. These child laborers not only received extremely low wages, but also were frequently beaten, forced to work long hours without breaks, and were crippled and killed in accidents. Naturally, the abuse of children and other injustices led to a growing resentment among factory workers against their employers. The Luddites were a violent expression of this resentment. The Luddites set about destroying the factories that they blamed for causing so much misery in society. Their anger, though, was misplaced, since the means of production do not cause misery. Machines are simply means by which owners and workers use to make products. These means can be used justly or unjustly. One main reason why there was so much unjust use of workers at factories was because there was practically no safety net for workers to fall back on, nor was there adequate legislation protecting workers from abuse. A possible explanation why these were absent is traceable back to the 1530s and 1540s, when Henry VIII was King of England. After declaring himself in 1534 as the head of the church in England, Henry VIII then set about suppressing thousands of Catholic-inspired guilds and dissolved Catholic monasteries. A few centuries later, across the English Channel in France, Catholic guilds and monasteries were similarly abolished during the French Revolution. Up until their suppression and dissolution, Catholic guilds and monasteries provided a social safety net for workers and for the poor to fall back on. During the medieval times, merchants and artisans united themselves into groups called guilds that had a set hierarchy, ensured quality products were produced, and provided welfare for the members of the guilds and their families. Another similar medieval institution were monasteries, principally Benedictine monasteries. According to Chapter 53 of St. Benedict's Rule, a rule that had a profound impact on the development of Western civilization, I quote, "Let all guests who arrive be received like Christ, for he is going to say, 'I came as a guest, and you received me.'" In accordance with this rule, monasteries welcomed guests hospitably, including poor guests, permitted peasants to farm and graze their lands, and even provided housing for poor students. The presence of monasteries, up until the time of Henry VIII, permitted upward social mobility that without the hospitality of monasteries would not have existed. In other words, By providing lodging to poor students, monasteries enabled these students to rise in social rank. After the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII, however, the gap between social classes widened and opportunities for upward social mobility decreased. Since Henry VIII in the 1500s repressed these two institutions, that each in their own unique manner provided a system of welfare, and in the case of guilds included legislation that ensured just working conditions, when the Industrial Revolution began in England during the 1700s, factory workers, in particular children, lacked protective organizations that could have been in place if Henry VIII had permitted guilds and monasteries to exist and develop. Workers during the Industrial Revolution then naturally began looking for some type of institution that would ensure they were working in a just environment. They looked towards the anonymous centralized state to provide them with a safety net and began to form unions that were not informed as the guilds were by Catholic beliefs and practices. Competing ideologies of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was prepared by and led to a number of competing ideologies. The two main ones were capitalism and socialism. These ideologies explained and responded to the Industrial Revolution's working conditions and reliance on child labor in significantly different ways. Eventually, the public dissatisfaction with the working conditions led a number of states to pass legislations that, when enforced, regulated factory working conditions. Mercantilism. Up until the effects of the Industrial Revolution became prominent in the late 1700s, the dominant economic model was mercantilism. According to the mercantilist theory, economic activities are to be directed by the heads of state, typically monarchs, with the purpose of strengthening the state. For this reason, in the 1400s, the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus was directly supported by Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, with the hope that Columbus's explorations would build up Spain. While this is commonly viewed as an example of mercantilism in action, it is difficult to define what mercantilism actually is. This is because the term mercantilism came into existence not by its supposed proponents, but rather by those who opposed the understanding of economics, where national leaders protected merchants, and merchants depended on the nation's rulers, principally monarchs. One famous opponent to mercantilism was the Scotsman Adam Smith, who used this term in his 1776 Wealth of Nations to describe a state-directed approach to economics. The following represents a common understanding of the premises underlying mercantilism. Note well, due to the history of the term mercantilism, the opinion that this term can be defined by a set of a number of principles has been dismissed by a number of scholars, but I'm including these principles because it will help us to understand our survey of history better. The first premise of mercantilism, supposedly, is that wealth defined by land, gold, and other hard assets is quantifiable, material, and hence limited. So wealth is limited because it's material. Wealth, therefore, is increased by taking material assets away from other nations. Ideally, this means that in order to build up a state, goods are not to move freely across state lines, but rather goods that come from other countries are to be taxed in order to give a competitive advantage to the home country. And similarly, goods that are sold in rival countries or colonies are not to be taxed by the receiving country. Laissez-faire capitalism or economic liberalism. Adam Smith, in his previously mentioned work, The Wealth of Nations, proposed an alternative economic system that was beginning to naturally emerge in the wake of the Industrial Revolution as the middle class began to emerge. This new economic vision has been named in a variety of ways, including laissez-faire, free market capitalism, and economic liberalism. In French, laissez-faire literally means let them do. As applied to economics, this terminology indicates that it is in the best interest of a nation to let the economic system alone and not interfere with it, which is also why it is called free market capitalism and economic liberalism, from the Latin word liber, meaning free, in the sense of leaving markets alone by not taxing goods that come into a country. As argued by Adam Smith, when a king or nation-state leaves the economic market alone, the market will naturally adjust itself in a much better way than a political ruler or leaders can ever do. This is so, explains Adam Smith, because the economic marketplace is ruled by a self-regulating mechanism that he calls, only once in Book 4, the invisible hand. Socialism. In reaction to the excesses of the Industrial Revolution and the economic and political theories that were relied upon to rationalize these injustices, such as in a highly competitive world relying on cheap child labor is necessary for economic development, another political ideology developed. It was called socialism. The early socialists coming from France and England did not emphasize competition, but rather cooperation among people who are essentially social in nature. These early socialists were criticized by later socialists, principally Karl Heinrich Marx and Friedrich Engels, as idealists who lacked a scientific method to implement these noble ideas. Marx consequently referred to his brand of socialism as scientific, since it followed and promoted trends in history that he argued naturally occur. Realism, an art style that can be considered as representative of certain aspects of the Industrial Revolution, is realism. Artistic realism depicted people in everyday situations, even if this included features some would deem as ugly, such as exhausted, sweaty men who are breaking rocks in a quarry on a dismal day. The success of realist art was in part due to a new clientele of art who owed their existence to the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the patrons of the arts were the few, wealthy, powerful aristocrats working directly for the state. These patrons had a vested interest in supporting only artists who would create works that affirmed the aristocrat's social status. During the Industrial Revolution, though, a new class of people became prominent, the middle class. Many members of the middle class were merchants, and some even became owners of factories. This new class had a vested interest in downplaying the status of the aristocrats, who were born into their social status. One way of achieving this was by supporting artists who were willing to depict in their artwork the reality that the majority of the population experienced, and not simply depict the experiences of a few privileged people. And in your transcript, I provide various examples of realist art, beginning with the Frenchman Gustave Courbet, who in defending realist art stated, "I cannot paint an angel because I've never seen one." There's a famous painting that he painted is called The Stone Breakers, and another famous one is called Interior of My Studio, a real allegory of 7 years of my life as a painter, or The Artist Studio. In describing this painting in a letter to a friend, Courbet wrote, "I am not yet dead, or realism either, for this is realism." And then he defines it. "In it are the people who thrive on life and those who thrive on death. It is society at its best, its worst, its average. I am in the center, painting. On the right are the shareholders, that is my friends, the workers, the art collectors. On the left, the others, the common people, the destitute, the poor, the wealthy, the exploited, the exploiters, those who thrive on death." Notice the artist, his female model, a small boy, a dog, those in the center admiring his painting. If you look at the transcript, what is more real, the painting of the landscape by the artist, or the people of the painting who are admiring Courbet as he paints? Interesting question. Jean-Francois Molay is another French realist painter, famous for The Sower, The Gleaners, The Angelus. Honoré Daumier comes during this time. He is a French printmaker, painter, and sculptor. Also a realist artist at times. Winslow Ulmer was an American painter known for his realist art, and Wilhelm Liebel was a German realist painter. Symbolism. This late 19th century art movement was a reaction to realism, but it can be seen as a desire many people felt of escaping from the dreary existence of factory life, brought upon by the Industrial Revolution, had helped to foster. In symbolism, imagination, dreams, and the fantastic are depicted. And just examples are the German symbolist painter who's Carlos Schwab, and he painted The Gravedigger. Fernand Knopf, a Belgian symbolist painter, is the Sphinx, and Viktor Vasnetsov, a Russian painter, is this beautiful painting called The Flying Carpet. God bless.